Good afternoon and welcome to Oasis. I am Dr. Alicia Daly, Associate Professor of Social Work at Manchester University, and
I'm Dr. Janine Armstrong, Assistant Professor of Communication Studies.
And we are privileged to be here today with you to talk about Juneteenth and the history and present day celebrations, and then what we can do in the future. And sometimes you may feel uncomfortable, but you can't grow without feeling uncomfortable. So that's a good thing if you feel uncomfortable. We will hopefully have time to have questions and answers at the end of the presentation.
All right, so just a bit of an overview of what we're going to cover today. You'll see that we'll start off with the past, giving a little bit of background about how did Juneteenth come about. Then we'll move on to talking about the present, how did it become a federal holiday, some of the things that you may look and see when you see people celebrating Juneteenth. And then the future. What can we all do to create a spirit of Juneteenth all day, every year? So let's start in talking about the past. And Dr. Daly already mentioned some of that uncomfortable truth, so let's start off with that uncomfortable truth. There we go.
As I was doing research for this, I came across this disturbing fact that 12 of the first 18 presidents, it says here, between 1789 and 1877, were slave owners. I'm going to let you sit with that for a minute, including George Washington. And there's actually a YouTube video from PBS that is posted that talks about how George Washington's slaves were with him and his wife Martha, because originally she owned them, in the first White House in Philadelphia. So it hurts me when people just kind of ignore this history and just talk about how great the founding fathers were, like they could not sin, they could not do anything wrong, when you have people who owned other people. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, you may or may not have heard that he had 6 children by one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, and they have actually done the DNA testing, and there are current, present day descendants of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And I just want you to see the names of 12 presidents who were slave owners, including, you may think, well, Ulysses Grant was from the North. Racism doesn't have a geography, okay? It is what's called ubiquitous. In other words, it's everywhere. It may change forms, look different in different places, but it's everywhere. Oh, I'm sorry. You had it. I'm sorry. So let's look at some of the monumental legal milestones when we're leading up to Juneteenth. The first one that everyone focuses on is President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. However, one of the things that is not talked about very often is that this was limited to, and I don't want to go ahead and get here, but this was limited. So I'm going to stop there because Dr. Armstrong will elaborate on this. This was limited. Then, after the Emancipation Proclamation, you see here, June 19th, 1865 was when this actually was enforced so that all the Confederate states had to stop slavery. And General Gordon Granger was the person, along with his troops, who actually came into Galveston, Texas, and declared that slavery had been abolished and enforced it. Then the third one, the third major milestone is the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. See, you can have a proclamation, just like now, you can have an executive order, but without a law or without a constitutional amendment, there are limits on how that executive order or proclamation, how it can be enforced. So a lot of times we celebrate June 19th, but the main date is December 6th, 1865, not January 1, 1863. So you see how long that process took.
So go ahead and building on top of that, we can see that most of us probably hear the Emancipation Proclamation and think, oh, well, that's what freed the slaves. But if we highlight the language that the Emancipation Proclamation said that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious areas are and henceforth shall be free. Well, that does not account for the states that actually had slavery but did not secede from the Union. So there were Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware that stayed with the Union. And therefore, this Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to them. Therefore, you see the need for additional laws and rulings to actually create freedom. Keep in mind that when Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, it was in the states that he had absolutely no power over. So to say, those slaves over there, they're free, but I can't actually enact anything to make them free. The hope was that when the slaves heard that they were free, they would rebel. And some did. But of course, it took 2.5 years for all slaves in the South, who were in the states that succeeded, to actually hear that they were free, and hence the General Order Number 3. Now, with this, you may be thinking, okay, got a good history lesson, but how did we get to where we are today? What does Juneteenth actually look like? Well, as most of us already know, it became a federal holiday. On June 17, 2021, Congress went ahead and passed it and made it a federal holiday, and it was signed into law by President Joe Biden. Here's a picture from that day, actually celebrating that it is now a federal holiday. Keep in mind that many states before had already had independent celebrations, Texas being the most common one of them, because of the fact that Juneteenth, June 19th, when it was actually General Granger riding into Texas, that's where it became the most prominent.
So this is the flag from Texas. The Juneteenth, as you know, Texas was the last of the Confederate states where slavery was abolished. And so this is the Juneteenth flag that came out of Texas. So if you look at it, red, white, and blue colors, it says here, the enslaved were Americans. And let me stop there just a moment, because there are a couple other things in history before this that you need to know about. One is something called the Dred Scott decision. This was where an African American who was a slave was suing a white American and in court. This went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then said in 1857 that black people were not American citizens. Therefore, they did not have any standing in any court to sue anybody. So this was the Dred Scott decision. Then you need to know, though, that later on, in fact, this was in 1868, July 9th, 1868, was the 14th Amendment. We're going to be talking about the 13th Amendment a little bit, but the 14th Amendment was what everyone who is born in the United States is considered a United States citizen. And as you may or may not know, the current administration is trying to change that. You know, the birther citizenship, they're trying to change that. And so this is an important amendment to know, because when you kind of start dismantling parts of the U.S. Constitution, you're really going to the core of our society. But that officially ended the Dred Scott decision. Although the 13th Amendment, which is the one that ended slavery, was the one that also kind of made the Dred Scott decision mute. But officially, it was 1868, July 9th, when you had passed the 14th Amendment. And so that gives me a little bit of hope for today, in that we have a lot going on the national level through executive orders and states and various things. But when you pass an amendment to the Constitution, you have to have, I think it's 2/3 of the states ratify that. And that is pretty much rock solid. And that gives me a little bit of hope for today, because we may need another amendment in order to counteract some of the things that are going on today. So that's the red, white, and blue, that African Americans were indeed citizens. You know, these were Americans. And then the 5-point star, as you see there, is referring to the state of Texas, the Lone Star State. And then the large star in the center there, the big star, was added to talk about freedom, had spread to Texas. Okay, so this is the history of what's called the Juneteenth flag. So if you hear about the Juneteenth flag and you see these colors, red, white, and blue, you'll be able to understand what the images mean. What the
Even though that's black, it's supposed to be blue, right? I mean, it looks black.
Right. And that may be, I don't know, technology, whatever. It's supposed to be blue. It's supposed to be red, white, and blue. It's a very dark navy blue. Okay. All right. So. Oh, and here's another flag you may or may not see. This is one you may see if, for instance, if you're around a group of African Americans, they may prefer this flag, because this is called the African Liberation Flag, which came into being, as you see there, in 1920. And these colors stand for, the red here stands for struggle and sacrifice. In other words, blood being spilled literally in order for us to have equal rights. And then the black stands for black people. And then the green stands for our connection as African Americans, our connection to Africa. And that is debated. You're not going to necessarily hear the same thing from every African American or every black person. But those of us who are of African descent still have a historical, cultural, even biological connection with Africa. And so the green stands for the fact that you can't go forward unless you look at your past. You have to acknowledge your past. And here is talking about the positive past of Africa. The Egyptian pyramids were in Africa. These mathematicians were Africans. Some of you who've studied theology or biblical studies, Augustine was an African, North African. Tertullian, who's the one who formulated the doctrine of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, was an African. And so when we talk about African liberation, we're just talking about our connection as a people to the Africans who have come before us.
And I will also add that when I think of Juneteenth, especially celebrating it as a child, I usually think of the red, black, and green, and sometimes the addition of yellow, you'll see that added as well, just because those were the colors most likely associated with Juneteenth for me. So at times when you'll hear people argue about, oh, we should shift all Juneteenth flags to red, white, and blue, and then you'll hear people say, well, this has been the legacy up until now. Therefore, why should we change those colors? So you may also hear those arguments when people are talking about the present aspects of Juneteenth. But as our students always like to point out, well, why do we need to know this history? What does it actually do for us? Because we can't really move forward unless we know what happened in the past. But now that we know a little bit more about what happened in the past and what has happened in the present, we can think about, okay, well, how do we incorporate the spirit of Juneteenth in the future? So we're going to break this down into 3 categories. There's the intrapersonal. Now, intrapersonal meaning the self, the things that we can do within our own bodies. So first, we'll have self-improvement regarding unconscious bias that is within all of us. Every single person, no matter who you are, has some type of bias. We may not even realize it until it confronts us directly. Thinking about the spirit of Juneteenth, we definitely need to think about, well, do I get nervous when someone who doesn't look like me walks in the room? Do I have maybe preconceived notions that someone from a lower socioeconomic status may not be able to be as smart or as interesting? Those different biases that we hold, we need to confront them. Because if we don't confront them, then we're just fostering them forward. And sometimes that can be very challenging to realize, like, oh, here's a bias I've held, and maybe I didn't realize it. And to also extend that and realize this bias that I hold is hurting someone else. Even if they never ever know that I have this bias, it is still causing pain because I may enact on that bias in some way. So I must be mindful and try to confront that. Then there's the interpersonal. So this is what we have with each other, our friends, our families, our coworkers, the people who are around us every single day. One of the best things you can do if you want to enact change is have a conversation. The difficult conversations that maybe are a little bit more challenging, it's always easier to have that conversation with someone you already know. They're more likely to trust you. There's been research done that when people leave the KKK, they usually leave because a friend saw them and said, why are you doing this? And that made them want to leave. When people are motivated to make changes within themselves, it's usually the friends, our family, our neighbors, who are our first teachers. Those are the people who make us want to go, why do I have this bias? Maybe I should think about my ideas differently. Thinking it more so and extending it directly to Juneteenth, have those conversations about racial inequality. We know that our country is not where we want it right now. I always have this positive bias that maybe if we just learn more, if we just talk to people, if we just maybe show a little bit more love and care towards people, then maybe we can address those big issues. But if we're not having the direct conversations and confronting what's the problem, then we won't be able to actually make progress. So make sure that you're having those conversations with people who look like you and who don't look like you. Because sometimes you'll learn things that you never knew. I was talking to my sister just today and another friend of mine, and I said, you know what, I have sunburn. And I have never had sunburn in my life. But it was because I have friends who don't look like me where I was able to go, oh, this is what this is. So sometimes even just learning from somebody else and their experiences can teach us so much. And then on the big scale, we have the institutional level. Now, this is what can feel a little bit more daunting, especially because we may think, I'm just one person, there's no way I can make a big change. But as you've noticed, we've moved from just the self to the relationships we have with other people, now to the big, because it has to start with the small. Some of the things that we can do to promote change within our religious organizations, we know that sometimes the most segregated day of the week is Sundays, because people want to go to where they feel community. But also, why are we not feeling community with people who don't visually look like us? That's a concern. Think about it at the educational level, especially we're both educators and we're thinking about how do we incorporate aspects that fit everyone in the room, that makes everyone feel seen. Criminal justice, political. I did a research study, and one of my participants said that the best way we can maybe help think about these institutional levels is we have to use our money and our vote to not spend money in places where we know they're causing harm, and to also make sure that we're voting for politicians who are actually going to make the world a better place. And then the hope is that with doing these changes, we can have a more perfect union. On the back of your handout, we also added a few other aspects, such as learning from other people. There's definitely histories that we maybe don't even realize are out there. We can definitely maybe talk to different community members and elders, participate in cultural events. Maybe you can throw a Juneteenth celebration next year. I know it's a little quick to do a Juneteenth celebration this year, but maybe even next year, having a party for your friends and neighbors. And then even just reflecting and coming back to those big questions about how I can change on the intrapersonal level.
Right, so it is 4:20, so we want to leave time for questions. Not that necessarily can we answer all the questions, but there may be some time here where we can start a discussion.
Now that it's a national holiday, is all the states have to close, like post offices and everything? Is that what it's Friday, right?
This is a, go ahead, you want to go ahead?
No, you got it.
Then you can.
What's going to happen on Friday across the United States?
It is a federal holiday, so technically only federal employees have the day off. Some states have also said that this is a paid state holiday, but not all states.
I think about 28 have yet to say that this is a paid state.
How about Indiana?
No.
The North Manchester Public Library is going to close on Friday for the Juneteenth celebration observance.
So it seems like certain places are saying, yes, we'll close, but it's not mandated across Indiana.
The post offices will be closed.
Yes, anything federal.
They're federal. And some states, while they may not close, they may allow a state employee to take that time off, like as a floating holiday, but they are not going to close state offices. Other questions, comments? Oh, sir?
This is old history. I was on an Illinois State University campus. I was one of the assistant deans there. At a time when Kent State riots were going on. And I was privileged to be part of a three-person there were three of us that were chosen by the black community who are also protesting something else that was going on the campus. And my experience with that group was so important for me for later on, because they gave me an instruction that I had really never had never been exposed, and I began to grow at that point. It was just one of those situations where a young dean is learning from their students about life. And you're absolutely right that it is necessary for people to speak out, because that is how other people learn as well. So it was a grand experience. It's one of those things that I would have to say was a watershed moment for me.
Thank you for sharing. There were some others. Marie?
When you were sharing the history,
on our paper is the 1808 Congress banning the importation of enslaved Africans. So there were 60 years in there where importing was banned, but it probably continued, didn't it?
There are definitely reports of smuggling human cargo, unfortunately, during that time, as well as the fact that slavery still happened inside the states. So children were still being born and immediately going into slavery. So
But did they not have slave auctions and stuff like that? Did that stop in 1808, I wonder?
not necessarily, slaves were still sold, but basically the import across nations had to stop. Well, legally had to stop. We know it did not fully stop.
And I might as well go ahead and share another very painful historical, and I already mentioned about Sally Hemings. But one of the ways that slavery continued domestically is that slave owners raped their African female slaves. And then when the child was born, this is an interesting fact. When the child was born, because technically a child was biracial, okay, or some of us would say mixed. Technically the child was biracial because the father was white, the mother was of African descent. But this was ingenious as well as being evil, in the sense that they said instead of, for slaves, let's not trace their genealogy through the father, which we are generally considered still a patriarchal society where, you know, the father's last name and you trace your lineage through the father. They said, well, let's trace the history through the mother. So since the mother was African and was a slave, therefore the child, even though the child was biracial, was also designated as being African and therefore being a slave. You all have heard of I should say some of you, if not many of you, have heard of the one-drop rule, where if you have one drop of black blood, which of course this has no scientific support, but the feeling was if you had one drop of black blood, meaning if there was anyone in your lineage who was black or African, then you were considered black or African, and then would suffer whatever the rest of the African Americans were suffering, regardless of how you looked. So that's just something to think about. Slavery did continue, like Dr. Armstrong said. It didn't. It was stopped from the trade from Africa, but it continued within domestically. And sometimes they forced male African slaves to impregnate African, whether they were married to them or not, forced them, because they call them studs, and forced them to have sex with African female slaves.
Only about 388,000 Africans arrived in the United States. Yeah, and there were 10.7 million that survived the voyage. Okay, where did the rest of these people go?
Many, were you going to say?
Go ahead.
Many went to South America, but the Americas, okay, so there was South America, there's also Central America. There were other places, the islands, that's why you have Haitians and others. So there are many people who have African descent, you know, African lineage in them that we may not normally consider African, but there are many groups.
Is there going to be any kind of local celebration, like, is the university doing something on Friday? What's going on here? Anything at all to celebrate Juneteenth on Friday? Do you know?
Not that I know
As
of.
far as I know, Manchester is not celebrating Juneteenth. Okay. One of the things we did get done at Manchester was that for a while Manchester was not even celebrating Martin Luther King's holiday, even though, in case some of you know, Martin Luther King spoke at Manchester University in 1968, and Manchester was the last university, not the last speech, but the last university where he spoke before he was assassinated. So some of us then went to the administration saying, why is it that we're not, recognizing his birthday? Yet we refer to him often as far as that he was we were the last university where he spoke. So we do have that, but sometimes change is incremental.
We're trying by having you here and talking to us.
Yes.
So we at least know.
Yes, you have no.
Know is first.
Right.
I think it's 4:30. Is that correct?
Yes.
It's 4:30, so we want to be obedient to the time given to us. Thank you so much for your presence and your participation.